After his military service with the Australian military, he was a chief strategist for the Office of the Coordinator for Counterterrorism at the State Department. And then he was a senior advisor to somebody you all know, General Petraeus, and really was very much a part of the surge and advising General Petraeus and obviously the president as well by extension. And he's a senior fellow at CNASA Center for for New American Security and an adjunct professor at SAIS, Johns Hopkins University for Advanced International Studies. So without further ado, David, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, Ian. So it's wonderful to be back, and I wrote this book, right? So I thought that I would give you a little bit of some of the major ideas that are in the book until essentially I get tired of talking about it and I see your eyes starting to glaze over, and then we might go to Q&A. I'm in the 5th week of going around giving basically the same talk about the book, so I'm pretty tired of it. So what I thought I'd do is just kind of move past that and try to have a bit more of a conversation. I think this is a very engaged group, and previously when I've spoken at the Marines Memorial Club, we've had some really good discussions about not only the sort of technical detail of how stuff happens, but the bigger geopolitical and sort of future picture. So to me, that's the interesting bit, is the discussion with you guys. I'm going to try to throw out exactly enough that we have something to talk about, but not so much that I bite too much into question and answer time. So let me just give you the sort of background to why I wrote the book and the main ideas that are in it. I started writing this in September of 2009, right after actually the most recent time that I got ambushed in Afghanistan, which was in eastern Nangarhar province, a place called Dara-e-Noor district, and it was one of these classic Afghanistan ambush scenarios. Most people in Afghanistan in eastern Afghanistan anyway, live in mountain valleys. They live in these little villages strung out along the floor of valleys. Nobody really lives high on the mountains. They all live down in the valley floor. And there's usually only one road that runs down the middle of the valley. So if you go up that valley in the morning, by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, everybody knows exactly where you're going to be, which is, driving down the road in the middle of the valley. And so I got ambushed at about sort of 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I remember thinking to myself, this is a pretty bad ambush. I've been involuntarily in a lot of ambushes over the last decade or so, and actually I taught ambushing at the tactics school as an infantry instructor. So I was thinking to myself, if these guys are my students, I'd probably fail them on their ambush plan. It was just very badly put together. And I was like, they're having a bad day, or what's going on? And I realized after about a day of thinking about it, this was not a Taliban ambush at all. What this was a particular village in the valley that was pissed about how much aid we'd given to a couple of other villages, and they were essentially sending us a message about how they felt about our aid prioritization, which seems like a crazy overreaction, right? But if you spend any time in Afghanistan, you'll know that happens all the time. And it turns out that the assistance we give to Afghanistan, which is about 14 times the size of the annual Afghan government budget, is actually responsible for a very substantial amount of the violence that we see on the ground. I'm going to give a shout out to Will Upshur and John Roginski here, who we worked together in southern Afghanistan in 2010, 2011, doing exactly this, trying to pull apart the sort of surface layer of what you see in the conflict and look beyond and behind that to what's actually going on that you don't necessarily see immediately as you look at the violence. What I've tried to do in the book is to start with that sort of conversation that I was having in my head in Afghanistan in about 2009, where I started to say, there's a deeper level here than just counterinsurgency doctrine. This is not just about an insurgency that's fighting a government. It's also about a bunch of villages that are trying to gain authority over other villages. It's about the direction of contracting money and the direction of aid assistance and the way people fight over that. And it's also about the sort of dynamics of conflict that are common to not only insurgencies, but also gangs and militias and all kinds of non-state armed groups that compete to control populations essentially across the planet 24/7, whether you be in a war zone or not. But as I wrote the book, I really started to realize that what we're doing in Afghanistan is something of a geographical fluke. And that's what actually most of the book ended up being about, which is if you look for the last 10 years at what we've been doing, we have gotten really, really good at dealing with non-state armed groups in a very traditional, very xenophobic society, in remote rural villages, in this kind of landlocked mountainous environment, like the environment that I was talking about where I got ambushed, where the population density is very low, the level of connectivity is basically non-existent, and people are kind of scattered in these little remote outposts. If you look to the future of the planet and you think what's actually going to happen after Afghanistan is over and after we move on to the sort of next round of conflict, what you find is that that's not what the future of the environment is going to look like at all. We're going to be much more in an urban littoral that is coastal and very, very highly connected environment. We'll be doing a lot of the same things we've been doing for the last decade. 80% of conflict across the planet is and always has been irregular in nature. That is, one of the main combatants is almost always a non-state armed group, and that pattern goes right back to the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815. More precisely, in US military history, there's a really specific and repeated pattern that we do a large-scale or long-duration insurgency or stabilization operation about once every 20 to 25 years. And we do little ones, sort of the size of Kosovo or Sierra Leone or East Timor, about every 5 to 10 years. And that pattern goes right back to the middle of the 19th century. And it's completely independent of policymakers' preferences. So I heard somebody say to me the other day, well, didn't the president already say that we're going to get out of this business? And I'm like, he did. He's the 7th president in the last 80 years to make basically exactly the same statement. And there's no detectable effect of whether the president wants to do it or not on how often we do this stuff. So looking forward, we're going to be doing kind of more of the same stuff, but the environment in which we're going to be operating looks very different. So 4 big factors drive that environment, and I've tried to think about what is the shape of the future environment and what impact will it have. And 3 of them are old, 1 of them's new, and it's the 4th one that I really want to focus on. But let me cover the first 3, just to get them out of the way. So the 4 factors are urbanization, population growth, littoralization, which is the tendency for things to cluster on coastlines, and then connectivity, which is the new factor. So if we start with population growth, at the beginning of the European Industrial Revolution in the middle of the 18th century, the population of the planet in 1750 was about 750 million people. It took 150 years for that population to double. So by 1900, we got to 1.5 billion people. We then doubled again in only 60 years to 3 billion people by 1960. We doubled again to hit 6 billion by the end of the last century. And in the dozen years or so since then, we've added slightly more than 1 billion people. So today, the population of the planet is roughly 7 billion. So you see this accelerating pattern of population growth since the Industrial Revolution. Now, people who do the projections and look at where population and demographics is going suggest that we're not going to keep on rising at the same level forever. We're going to top out at around the middle of the century at about 9.5 billion people on the planet. But that's still about 2.5 billion more people than we have now. In that same time frame, we're likely to see a reasonably or a really significant level of urbanization. So again, if we go back to the Industrial Revolution, in 1800, about 2% of people lived in a city of 1 million or more. So 2% of people on the planet were in a large city. By 1900, it was 10%. By 1950, it was 25%. By 2008, it was 50%. And the projection is we're looking at somewhere around 75% of people on the planet living in a major city by the middle of this century. So again, roughly the current population of the planet will be the urban population by the middle of the century. The third factor is littoralization. And it's a fact based, I think, just in the mechanics of moving heavy stuff, that most cities have traditionally been on coastlines. If you look at megacities in particular, that is cities of a population of 10 million or more, 21 out of the 25 largest cities on the planet are either directly on a coastline or on a major river delta. There's only 4 cities on the planet that are not, that is 4 megacities: Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, and Mexico City. All the other major 10 million or more cities on the planet are coastal cities. Why is that? Because it's a lot easier to move heavy things by water than by land. And so trade has traditionally been seaborne or riverborne, and so cities have tended to aggregate around logistics hubs And so as a consequence, because people move to existing cities, already the population of the planet is very heavily littoral. 80% of people on the planet today live within 50 miles of a coastline. So littoral, urban, crowded. Those three factors, extraordinarily well understood 20 years ago. And the Marine Corps in particular had guys like General Myatt from this club, or General Krulak, who talked about the 3-block war and the urban littoral. There were guys in the army like Ralph Peters and Robert Scales. I'm talking about people that are sort of military theorists of the 1990s who wrote all about this stuff, way back. Very, very well understood. But what's happened is in the 10 years or so since 9/11, or the 12 years since 9/11, two things have happened. One, the military has been dragged off into this environment that I've been talking about, the landlocked, remote, rural environment of Afghanistan. And secondly, the planet has changed in that time. In the year 2000, there were only 30,000 cell phones in Nigeria. Today, there are 113 million. When I was doing my field work in Mogadishu for the book, I was walking around on the street, essentially interviewing people and talking to people about how they make a living. 24% of Somalis own and use a cell phone. 20 years ago, last week, there was a big fight in Mogadishu that's been memorialized in a movie called Black Hawk Down, which some of you may have seen. That fight happened around the Bakara market, which is a major market in downtown Mogadishu. When I was there, I was talking to traders in that market where the Somali shilling, which is a currency that survived for 20 years without a state or a central bank, is traded on a floating interest rate. And the way that it works is they have computers set up, they're on the internet, they understand the international currency rates, and they trade the currency on a currency trading floor on the bottom floor of that market, and 5 times a day, they update the trading rate of the Somali shilling, and they fire it out by text message to several thousand traders who are all out in the city, and that's how they work the trades that they do. Now, Somalis have always been traders, but until recently, they weren't trading, international stocks or managing remittance money in St. Paul, Minnesota, or in Scandinavia. That's what we see now. And in fact, a lot of what I saw on the ground supported something that a lot of economists are saying now, which is that access to the international trading economy, which is dependent on connectivity, has become one of the really major elements in urban growth. It's replaced agricultural surplus as one of the reasons why people move to cities. Thinking about it in sort of scientific terms, it's kind of like an osmotic gradient, right? Where you've got a salty solution on one side of a membrane and a non-salty solution on the other. Ions are going to migrate from one side to the other. If you have a connectivity differential between urban environments and rural environments, people are going to move to where the connectivity is. And that's what we're seeing. Because if you want to be plugged into the international economy in the way that people in Mogadishu are, you've got to be in Mogadishu where there's connectivity. You can't be out in the countryside in Somalia. And so we've seen this really significant movement of population to cities that's driven in part by connectivity. And that connectivity actually shifts and changes the way that conflict happens. I'll give you 2 examples of that, and then I'm going to sort of summarize with some ideas about how to think about the environment. One of them is Libya, and the other one is in Syria. So in Libya in 2011, there was a very major fight in a coastal city called Misrata, and the French had a French naval task force offshore ready to intervene in the conflict. But they didn't really know very much about what was going on the ground. Now, this is a coastal city with an urbanized population, fairly well educated, and since 2003, Libyans have exploded in their access to things like cell phones and satellite phones and the internet. Libyan kids, school kids on the ground, were getting shot by regime snipers as they were trying to move around the city. So a bunch of Libyan schoolgirls began to use Google Earth and sat phones and Android cell phones to plot the locations of regime snipers that were shooting at them. So they would put like little pins on the map and to show like, hey, there's a sniper in this building, don't go down that street. The French, sitting offshore, start to see all these pins appearing on Google Earth, and they were like, what is that? So they flew a reconnaissance mission and they figured out these are regime positions. So when they noticed that, they started obviously to bomb the regime positions. When the school kids realized, hey, if we mark something on the map, the French are going to bomb it, they went out and just marked every regime position they could find. And as soon as things were destroyed, they would start taking them down and they would disappear again from Google Earth. So what we had, if anybody's a targeter in the audience, what we had was a completely self-synchronized, crowdsourced bomb damage assessment system, right? Which I think the Pentagon spent literally billions of dollars trying to build one of those, but we've got school kids doing this on the ground now because they have access to connectivity. That would literally have been impossible 3-4 years ago. The technology wasn't there and the level of connectivity wasn't out there. As far as I can tell, talking to kids on the ground and talking to people that were in the French task force, at no time did they ever actually talk to each other. It was just completely self-synchronized. They started to figure it out based on what they could see together looking at Google Earth. Second example is a little more analog. In Syria last year, and we do a lot of work in Syria for a couple of aid agencies and an NGO, our guys started to see these little armoured vehicles appearing. One of them was about 6 feet long and about 3 feet wide. It was built actually on a mini miner chassis with armour welded to the outside. This thing didn't have a turret. What it had was a machine gun mounted on top with an electric motor so that it could be controlled remotely from inside. It had a series of video cameras mounted on the outside, actually a GoPro, if you guys know what that is, like an action camera on the very top. And then inside was a flat screen TV. And the whole thing, both the driving of the vehicle and the control of the weapon system, was run through the flat screen television via a Game Boy game controller. This is built in a backyard workshop by a bunch of guys belonging to the Free Syrian Army. I showed this to some Army guys about 6 months ago, and they said, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense to build such a tiny armoured vehicle that only has a machine gun on it. But if you think about Aleppo, which is where this thing was built, if you try to take a Bradley or an Abrams, like American-style armoured vehicles, or a BMP, which is what the ex-Soviet vehicle that the regime uses, down a street in the back of Aleppo, you're not getting there because these streets are literally 4 or 5 feet wide. This thing doesn't have to confront other armoured vehicles. It's not going to see them because they can't get there. It's designed specifically to operate in the back streets of an old medieval Arab town against infantry who can't manoeuvre because they don't have the ability to bring tanks to bear. This is basically perfectly adapted to the environment. Again, the technology to even build this thing wasn't out there until about 5 years ago. But now what you're looking at is a very tech-savvy, technologically literate population that, because they're urban, they're all concentrated and they have access to things like the sorts of tools and systems you would need to make a tank in your backyard. Again, something that's not out there in Afghanistan, but what we see in most of the environments where we're likely to operate, this kind of urbanized, technically savvy population. Final example, in the US state of Georgia in May of 2011, a 15-year-old 9th grade kid called Steen Kirby looked at the Libyans and thought, you know, these guys don't really know how to use the weapon systems that they're capturing from the regime. So he crowdsourced in about 48 hours a bilingual Arab-English AK-47 manual to teach the Libyans how to use the weapons that they were capturing. He got all the stuff from old Soviet websites and got his friends and got people that could speak Arabic and pulled together this document. That today is the major document that's used across most of Syria in the fighting against the regime. Because neither Syria nor Libya were really gun cultures. Again, if you've operated in Afghanistan or Iraq, you're dealing with people that came up in a gun culture, right? So everybody knows how to fire a weapon. Once I was sitting with an Afghan tribal elder, and I asked him about, you know, where the IED techniques come from, and he said, "What do you mean?" And he called over his 15-year-old son and said, "Hey, make me an IED," and the kid just started to like pull one together, like they just know how to do it. People in Libya and Syria don't come from that background. They were, you know, shopkeepers and university students before the uprising, so they didn't have that background. But now you've got a situation where a kid in the United States can take 48 hours and pull together a manual that's now the dominant document that people use, and people just download this repeatedly off the internet, and it's out there as one of the key elements of how people operate out in Syria. So I don't want to belabor this point too much, but I think it's really important to understand that not only do we need to re-engage with the urban environment because we've been kind of distracted by 10 years of doing something that's not going to be the future norm, but also in that time the world's changed and it's dramatically more connected than it ever was. So how do we understand that? And this is the sort of topic that I'll end on. How do you understand an urban environment that's under massive stress, that's producing violence and producing all kinds of other problems? And this is a pressing issue not only for people that live in Syria, but for us, because this is something that's going to be happening basically across the planet. And I go back to Karl Marx, actually, weirdly enough. So Marx, whatever else he was a social scientist, and he was looking at European cities at the end of the first 100 years of the Industrial Revolution. So Berlin and London and all these places that he was looking at were experiencing many of the same things that we see in third world coastal cities today. And so he looked at the way that rapid urbanization and lack of government services and marginalization of communities and people getting alienated from the various systems that they need to access in order to survive, how that affects people. And when you take that and apply it to what you see on the ground in the third world today, there's actually a lot of similarities. But in the 60s, 1960s, a guy called Abel Wallman took one of Marx's ideas, the idea of urban metabolism, and wrote an article that's become very seminal in urban ecology, which is called the metabolism of cities. And Wallman basically says, just like a body has a metabolism, a city has a metabolism, right? You have various intakes, carbon, fuel, air, people, and as they come in, they get transformed by various processes, and it produces like the biomass of the city and the energy that the city needs to function, but it also produces toxic waste products. And the city needs to have the carrying capacity to metabolize or deal with those byproducts, or you're going to see the buildup of pollution. And this has become a really common analytical procedure in ecology now, looking at an urban environment and running what's called a material flow analysis to understand whether that environment has the carrying capacity to deal with the flow that it's experiencing. What I've done in the book, and I have a number of case studies of this, ranging from Jamaica to Mumbai to various other places that I worked for the book. What I've done is to do a non-material flow analysis. So instead of looking at carbon and water, looking at things like money and drugs and weapon systems and information and how they flow through an environment and what kinds of toxic byproducts, not pollution but usually violence, get generated by that, and what are the ways that a city can use to cope with those flows. And where I come down on this in the end is kind of paradoxical. It's that if you look at the problem set, the military really doesn't figure in your answer, right? There's really no military solution to the problem of rapid, unplanned urbanization across 2/3 of the planet, which is going to soak in, 3 billion new people in the next generation, which is the same number of people that it took all of human history to generate across the entire planet right up until 1960. You could put a Marine regiment or an Army division or an Air Force Expeditionary Air Wing into one of those cities and it would just disappear. No one would probably even notice it was there. We're talking about, cities like Lagos that will have 25 million people by 2040, the entire west coast of India being one single conurbation by 2040, giant cities that you just can't engage with in a traditional military sense. By the way, there is a detailed appendix in the book where I get right into the tactics of how you would do that, but I think there's really no solution that involves the military going in. So a problem focus doesn't result in a military solution. That's like looking at a big city and saying the solution here is fire prevention. That doesn't help you if you're in the fire department, right? If you're in the fire department, your job is not to worry about fire prevention. Your job is to fight the goddamn fires when they break out, right? So you have to think, okay, what do I do when fire prevention fails? So the paradox is if you're in the military, although there's not a significant likelihood of a military solution to a lot of these things, there's a dead certainty that our political leaders will continue to send us into these environments because that's what they've been doing for the last 200 years in a way that's completely unaffected by policymakers' preferences, as I mentioned up front. So if you're in the military, you better understand how to operate in a very crowded, urbanized, coastal environment against a non-state actor who has access to democratized technology and connectivity that makes that adversary dramatically more lethal than anything we've really ever encountered before. So that's the environment that the military needs to be thinking about, and it has some really significant implications for the way we structure and the kinds of things we buy and the way we operate. And that's one whole side of the discussion. But the other side of the discussion is, what are we doing about the problem? Because the solution isn't necessarily military. And I think that it's much more a matter of resiliency and community-based co-design rather than governments coming in, patting people on the head, sort of telling them to sit down and shut up while we give them the solution. And I can talk in much more detail about some of the things that we've done as in my little company with World Bank and NGOs and so on in Africa and Latin America, trying to sort of test some ways that we might operate. Here in San Francisco, you've got a great company called IDEO, which pioneered a thing called human-centered design, and has focused a lot on what I would call co-design, how you get outsiders who have certain kinds of technical knowledge and put them together with a community that understands a problem and comes up with innovative solutions that neither side could come up with. And I think some of the stuff that IDEO in particular have come up with is just brilliant. My challenge to them, and what my people that work for me do every day, is how do you do that in an environment where people are shooting at you, where the level of violence is so high that you just can't sit down with people and have a conversation. And that's the sorts of places that we work. And unfortunately, I think it's where people in the military and law enforcement and in the aid community really need to be focused in terms of thinking about the future conflict environment. Because I've been very down for the last 20 minutes or so, I'm going to end on an up note, which is it's not all bad, right? I mean, we're talking about 3 billion more people in urban environments by the middle of the century. Not only could that potentially be very good for the planet, right? It could really reduce pressure on the environment in some ways, but also we could be talking about 2 billion more people in the global middle class by the middle of the century, lifting people out of poverty, access to education, access to the means of economic prosperity. There's all kinds of upsides to this. If you're in business, there's a massive business opportunity here. I mean, these cities that we're talking about haven't even happened yet, and we're talking about the entire population of the planet in 1960 is going to need all kinds of stuff just to, get by in these big cities. So there's a significant upside to this. And in fact, there's a lot of good research data which suggests that as cities get bigger, their adaptive capacity and their ability to handle these kinds of problems actually increases faster than the scale of the problems. But there are certain things you've got to have in place if that's going to occur. And one of those is the ability to free up adaptive resources and make people more resilient. So I think the solution is ultimately not to be thinking about how do we stop this human tide that's going to be flowing into environments on coastlines in the developing world in the next generation. It's thinking about how do we teach people to swim? How do we think about urban resiliency in a different way that sort of exploits the kinds of adaptive capacity that are already out there and kind of helps people unlock that as a way to engage with these problems. So I hope I've given you guys enough to start a conversation. I could go on at length, but I'm kind of, like as I said, bored with giving the same talk for the last 5 weeks. So let's have the conversation.
One that you and I spoke about a little bit before, has come up at least twice, is this curse of preparing for the last conflict, right? And one, I think, very poignant question that came in was, what are some of the bad lessons that are probably going to be inappropriately weighted coming out of the Iraq and Afghanistan experience for our military and for maybe our governments as we approach problems moving forward?
Yeah, great question. Well, I see 2 equal and opposite errors creeping into a lot of the debate right now. One of them is like, coin's the answer, right? Counterinsurgency is the answer to the problem. Counterinsurgency is just a doctrinal construct that we built under fire in the last 5 years. And like any other doctrinal construct, it's a human model for looking at an environment. And as the environment shifts, your model has to shift, And I think we're about due for kind of a Kuhnian scientific revolution in the way that we think about the conflict environment, because we're getting enough data now about the future environment that contradicts our sort of basic counterinsurgency theory, that I think it's about time we started thinking about what comes next. The other opposite error is coin is not the answer, right? Like that we don't need to worry about non-state armed groups. We don't need to worry about protecting populations. We don't need to worry about going in and doing things for people that governments can't or won't do. Actually, the history is pretty clear on that fact that whether we know how to do it or not, we're going to be sent in there to do it. The other thing that I'd just highlight is I think that there's a very dangerous addiction, which I talk about a lot in the book, to what I call remote warfare. So to drones, to cyber operations, to things like what NSA's been doing in terms of collecting data, that sort of offer the promise of avoiding having to put boots on the ground. Right, and it always reminds me of something that Clausewitz wrote in On War. So, and I apologise for quoting Clausewitz, but he said, war is so dangerous that often the worst errors proceed from kind-heartedness, and I think some of the worst American errors in warfare proceed from trying to minimise the danger and the damage that conflict does. And one of those effects right now is this reliance on remote forms of technology to compensate for our unwillingness to put troops on the ground. one of the only things that stops human beings from fighting each other is when they've lost enough, that they've had enough and they stop fighting. If you outsource it to robots and you make it so that you create a precedent whereby we can kill anybody we want at any time across the planet, provided that it meets our own domestic legal requirement, that could really bounce back on us at some point.
Yeah, no, I see that. And I think maybe a related question is, what tactics and what conflicts in the past have been very relevant to, this world that you're foreseeing, and with that, what countries are best placed because of their experiences and their established TTPs, tactics, techniques, and procedures that they utilize in their local conflicts are relevant for us in the world you see.
Yeah. So firstly, I think that a lot of what we've done in Iraq and Afghanistan will translate at the tactical level to what comes next. And in particular, I just want to go on the record, for those that haven't spent a lot of time with the American military in Iraq or Afghanistan in the last decade or so, it's hard to realize exactly how good people have gotten at what they're doing. Stuff that the average American line infantry battalion can do now was only in the realms of special forces even 5 years ago. Stuff that special forces can do now was Hollywood 5 years ago. And the level of capability not only of the military but of the aid agencies and of the State Department and of the NGOs that are out there on the ground is really unparalleled in history. And to me, one of the great potential tragedies of what's coming up is that we may again forget everything we've learned at so much cost in blood and have to relearn it again. I would love to make some new mistakes next time around instead of having to make the same mistakes again. So that's that's part of this. But I think what I talk about a lot in the appendix is how the urban littoral changes conflict and what that means for the way that we think about the environment. It's actually a very, very complex, what I call a 9-domain challenge. So without getting too geeky on this, the military tends to think about things in terms of domains, and we talk about the land, maritime, and an aerospace domain. But if you think about an urban littoral environment, you're actually talking about 9 domains. There's a subterranean domain, there's the land surface, there's all the superstructure, the high-rise, what we used to call the urban canyon 20 years ago, the sort of rooftop environment. Then you've got the aerospace and the cyberspace that surrounds that. But then offshore, you've got a maritime aerospace domain, sea surface, subsurface, and seabed. And you've got a littoral kind of riverine harbours and creeks and rivers zone in the middle where there's this kind of overlapping effect of all these different domains. And the way that we've thought about operating in the future environment, I'm afraid, is not necessarily going to cut it in that 9-domain environment. In particular, and I'm conscious that I'm in a Marine establishment here, the Marine Corps idea of operational manoeuvre from the sea is extraordinarily well adapted for an environment where you don't have lots of urban environments, right? Once the entire seaboard is urban, ship to objective manoeuvre is going to look a hell of a lot different because you won't have a lodgement space to get into. For the Navy, sea basing, which is basically 10 days, 10 nautical miles, 1 to 2 selective offload logistics platforms, right? And a way of running logistics into an environment that means you don't have to seize a port or an airfield and you can stay at a standoff distance. That's not going to work when you're going into an environment primarily because you have to be there for a long period of time to engage with an urban structure that's not coping. For the Army, we've got really good over the last decade at running logistics through this kind of contracting mechanism where we go into an environment and we take up the things we need from the environment by means of contracts, fuel, water, food, and so on. And I would just say logistics is the key thing here, right? Tactics is easy. It's the logistics that's going to be the critical issue. That's not going to work when the reason you're going into environments is precisely because they don't have enough stuff, right? Because there's conflict emerging because of the way that urban environments are experiencing overstretch. To go in there with a bunch of contracting officers and say, hey, we want to buy up all your stuff that's already so scarce that you're fighting over it, that's not going to work. So a lot more to talk about on that particular question, but that's just kind of the wave top main issues.
Yeah. Maybe just a quick follow-up question that was in there that I think is interesting is, who's good at least the first 3 issues, right? I mean, certainly connectivity is one that is a rapid change, but for the first 3, who are experts in that in the world?
Well, the US is really good at urban operations. Probably the only country in the last 12 years that's really done significant urban combat was the United States military in Iraq. The only nation, interestingly, that's done any kind of urban littoral in the last decade was the British in Basra. And they have actually got pretty good at thinking about how to operate in an urban coastal environment. I think that one of the key things that jumps out at me as I look at this is how do you organise junior level commanders to operate effectively? And you're looking for a different kind of guy to run your squad or be your platoon sergeant than you may have already in the organisation. The French, weirdly enough, are really good at the way that they structure and organise junior commanders, and we can get into it in detail if you want, but it's completely different to how we do it. And then there's a few other folks out there. I think there's a discussion to be had also with the law enforcement community, because what we see in counter-gang operations and in counter-organised crime, and in the way that policing thinkers, and I talk to a lot of them and quote them in the book here, have been thinking about this over the last 10 years or so, is really relevant to what we're dealing with. And it may look a lot more like what, say, the Brazilian police are doing in favelas right now around Rio than it looks like what the military typically does.
Yeah. Good questions around this fourth component, right? The connectivity issue, and potentially the increased importance of having citizen soldiers, right? The idea that there is so much happening in the private sector that is very dynamic, especially in this communication age, that how can we incorporate the citizen soldier better in the American military? And there was a question specifically around how the Australian military may do that better.
Yeah, great questions. I'm just going to focus on one issue. I think there's a lot of other things we could talk about, but actually I'll focus on two. One is how we use people that understand big data, and the other one is how we use people that understand the environments where we're going to be operating in. So my academic background is actually in political anthropology, right? Which is a funny old colonial discipline, basically, where you go and do a postgraduate degree, you put on a funny hat, and you go to somebody else's country, and you basically write back a report for all your white friends on how the savages behave, right? There's literally a book called The Sexual Life of Savages in the South Pacific, which is a classic book in anthropology written by a guy called Bronislaw Malinowski, who basically traveled to the Trobriand Islands off of New Guinea in the early 1910s and 1920s and came back and wrote this kind of lurid account of how things happen in New Guinea. When I started looking at the urban environment, coming from that academic background, I was like, I need to go out there and build my own model of what, you don't need to do that anymore. All these people are connected. The environment is out there and it's talking to us directly. And in fact, there ought to be, if there's not, a crisis of confidence among anthropologists because their discipline is actually disappearing. When I started looking at the favela of La Rocinha outside of Rio de Janeiro, I thought I'm going to have to go walk the streets and engage in sort of participant observation of life in a favela, which obviously you do still need to do some of that, and I did that in Jamaica and a bunch of other places. But there's 20 bloggers who all write out of La Rocinha, and one of them writes this great blog about how governance functions in an environment that's run by gangs. He writes in English. It's pretty easy to talk to the guy. You can pick up the phone. The work that we do in Syria right now, we have 4 teams on the ground doing humanitarian aid reporting for an NGO and USAID. We don't have any of our own people there. All of our teams on the ground are Syrians because you don't need to be putting people out there. So I think that's one element that I would be sort of thinking about. How do you leverage the diaspora that we have already in this country with people from basically every country on the planet with the kinds of language skill and knowledge and relationships to tap into that environment to just understand what's going on in the environment. And again, I want to emphasize there's no military solution here. This isn't about spying on the environment. It's just about understanding what's going on. The other thing is big data. It is now possible to really understand through sort of the remote observation of honest signals about an environment what's going on in a way that it just wasn't possible 5 or 10 years ago, right? You can be sitting in San Pedro Sula, which is a major city in Honduras, which has the highest murder rate on the planet, and you can essentially fire up Google Maps in the morning, and just based on traffic patterns, if you have the right algorithm and you understand how to read what you're looking at, you can understand which streets to avoid because of the way that the traffic moves. People do that. And I think I was actually out at Google today talking to a bunch of engineers about how they do big data analysis, and one of them said to me, there's actually no solution here. And I think he's right in the sense that there's no holy grail that's going to allow us to solve these problems through big data, but it will allow people that live in these environments to be more resilient, right? To actually figure out workarounds to actually exist in an environment that's growing rapidly and maybe dominated by a non-state armed group that allow them to sort of still function. So I don't want to be all sort of Mad Max Thunderdome, right, about the future, but I think leveraging people that come from the places where we might be likely to operate and leveraging people that can bring together kinetic field operations on the ground with an understanding of the big data picture, that to me, that's the sort of critical stuff that we're not doing right now that we need to be doing a little bit better. To the extent that it exists, it's within a very, very small community within the military. Actually, it needs to be much broader, and it needs to be not just the military. I mean, every police department is going to need to do what the New York Police Department does, which is have people overseas engaging with other police and talking about what's going on in other environments around the world.
Yeah, well, certainly this place is, Marines of Morale has been very involved with what Fleet Week has become and looking at humanitarian disaster relief or disaster response and integrating kind of federal assets with local law enforcement and local emergency responses is a component of, I think, this next question, which is, we've spoken about people that are experts of tactics, but using design thinking, what does the governmental structure or intergovernmental structure look like to be effective in a situation like this? I mean, we're looking at military issues, we're looking at policing issues, we're looking at information issues, we're looking at pure technology components.
So I did a number of case studies on the book. I looked at the Mumbai attack in November of 2008. I looked at gang warfare in Jamaica. I looked a little bit at Sri Lanka. I looked a lot at conflicts in the Arab Spring, went out on the ground in Somalia and so on. And one of the key themes that came out from all these research efforts was that actually national governments matter a hell of a lot less than we might think. And in fact, the city rather than the nation state is probably the unit of analysis that we need to be applying here. What happens at the urban, like the level of city government and sub-city government turns out to matter a lot more for the outcome of these kinds of issues than what happens in the national government. Good example of that is two good examples. Mogadishu has been without a central national government for 20 years, and yet the city is still functioning basically about as well as it did before 1991. Richard Norton, who's a Naval War College professor, coined the term feral cities based on his observations of what happens to cities when national governments collapse. And I think Mogadishu is a great example of a feral city. We often think that governments create cities and that if the government goes away, the city will collapse. Actually, the research shows you that governments don't create cities, they domesticate cities, they tame them. And when the government goes away, the city doesn't go away, it just goes wild. And you get this kind of Mad Max environment that we see in Mogadishu. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that I think we need to be thinking about, again, resiliency, not stability. So stability is a system's characteristic, right? A system is either stable or unstable. Dynamic disequilibrium is probably a better way of describing it. If we look at cities, we don't see stable systems. We see open systems that have continual input that are in a situation of dynamic disequilibrium. Dhaka, the capital of Bangladesh, is a great example of that. In 1950, Dhaka was 400,000 people. Today it's 12 million. It's going to be 25 million by 2025. And a whole series of national governments have come up with fixes to deal with the problems of Dhaka that have repeatedly been overtaken by events. So by the time they were able to be implemented, with all the coordination that's required at the nation-state level, they were already too late to affect the things they were trying to change. So getting it down below nation-state to the city and the sub-city environment, I think is really important. And without getting offensively awesome about this, I look at this as kind of an urban fractal pattern, right? So you see the same stuff repeated at the street, block, sub-district, district, city, and national level. And often the fixes are similar, but they sort of, with a twist, right, at each different level. So I think when you learn what works at the street level or works at the district level, you can start to then model, what's going to work at other levels in that fractal pattern.
Motivations for violence as a concept, I think, is something that we've seen here a little bit, and I'll pose two. One, very aggressive Gini coefficients that look at that make one think about the disparity between the wealthy and those that are in need.
By the way, there's actually not a strong correlation in the literature or in the field research between just a straight large Gini coefficient and a high degree of violence. The correlation is between inability of people that are shut out by the system to access the system, rather than just the fact that there's a disparity between, rich and poor.
Yeah, no, so I think...
Sorry, go on.
No, that was actually, that came up in one of these about just education and leveraging education when there is
Right, yeah.
So a place like Angola here, where there is a lot of wealth, right, and the ability to create systems for education to kind of bridge that gap.
Right.
So motivations being, seeing the grass greener on the other side and wanting it, whether that's wealth or influence in the country's future or the organization or the environment's future. And then black market business, right? Drugs and arms being kind of a fuel for the violence and a reason for the violence.
So actually the single biggest motivator for violence that I saw on the ground was predictability, weirdly enough. And I'll explain that in a minute. But think about a city as a system, right? And you've got the city with people moving and settling in slum areas around the outside of the old city. And that goes on for a generation. Where those people settle, you end up with a horseshoe-shaped or donut-shaped ring of territory where there is now a whole series of slums that are around the old city environment. Not a lot of government presence, no government services. A lot of people in there are excluded from the mainstream of the economy or from politics. And there was a time there after 9/11 where we used to talk about ungoverned spaces. I don't know if anyone was in the military at that time, and we used to have this whole fear of ungoverned spaces. It was kind of like the here be dragons theory of counterinsurgency, right? Like if there's no government presence, there must be bad guys there. I went into a lot of these ungoverned spaces, including slums in Africa and a bunch of other places as I was doing the research. They're not ungoverned at all. They're very thoroughly governed, but just not by the government, right? Because what happens is when that happens, a non-state armed group emerges, and the role they play is much more like the police force in the center of town than it is like sort of terrorists or insurgents. Good example is the Jamaican drug smuggling gang that I analysed in one of the chapters, where we got the Jamaicans to mortar and rocket their capital city and basically invade a whole district within Kingston in order to deal with this one guy, Dudas Coke, who was smuggling cocaine into the United States. It's part of this drug trafficking organization called the Shower Posse. If you talk to people on the ground in Jamaica, they don't think of it as a drug smuggling organization. In fact, that isn't what it is. That's just one of the things that it does. It sells drugs to rich white foreigners on the other side of the continent. What it does on the ground in Kingston is much more like the government. It gets you a job, provides health support, it keeps down petty crime, it manages the transportation system, it's the mechanism by which you access things like fuel and water and electricity. It's essentially the government, right? And just like our government kills people overseas, and it's a negative externality of the United States, for people that live in Tivoli Gardens, which is this big slum in Jamaica, the fact that their government sells drugs to rich white guys in New York City is kind of, okay, it's not the main issue. So I think thinking about that sort of city as a system, the main motivations for violence for most people that I've spoken to are getting away from a really dangerous environment of unpredictable uncertainty to an environment where I know exactly what I need to do to be safe. And what happens is one of these non-state groups comes in and sets down a rule set, which I call a normative system in the book, and basically says, here's the rules. If you follow the rules, I will protect you and I will not hurt you. If you break the rules, obviously you're at risk. And basically that seems to have a very attractive effect on populations that are kind of buffeted by uncertainty. They don't know how to be safe. And when they get this very clear rule set, they essentially flock to that and come under the control of this non-state armed group. The effect that I think is also very interesting is the effect that has on politicians in the downtown urban area, because that ring of territory that we're talking about, it didn't used to be vacant before there were slums there. That's where the city used to grow its food. It's where the catchment area used to be for the water. So now you've got non-state armed groups who essentially have a chokehold on the city because they control a ring of territory, and all the stuff that the city needs to survive has to run the gauntlet of that territory to get inside. So politicians end up making deals with these non-state armed groups just in order to make the city survive. And we can look at that and say that it's corrupt. But I had guys in Nairobi say to me, well, what am I going to do? Like, if I don't deal with these gangs, they're going to shut the city down. So, I think there's a lot of motivations for violence, but it really ultimately, I think, boils down to this quest for predictability and certainty in this rapidly growing, disequilibrium environment.
So what's the relevance of traditional alliances like NATO, in a world that is dealing with non-state actor repercussions, right? Ramifications of humanitarian issues that present themselves in low-level violence.
I think NATO is still very relevant because even though a lot of the problems are happening at the city and below city level, the way that militaries and diplomatic services and aid agencies engage in solving those problems works mainly through international institutions like the UN and through alliances. And in fact, NATO right now are thinking about what they're going to do post-Afghanistan. And part of the conversation that I've been having with people in NATO is around this issue of actually Afghanistan's a bit of a geographical fluke. So if you optimize for what we've just spent the last 10 years doing, you're going to be awesome at fighting the 9% of people that you're never going to fight in the future, right? I mean, conflict will still happen in that environment, but it's not necessarily going to require the same kinds of things that we've been doing for the last decade. So I think NATO, to a lesser extent the UN, but interestingly some other organizations like the World Bank and the Asian and African Development Bank have started to think about how to address this stuff. And there's a program right now that we do a bit of work with in Africa called Violence Prevention through Urban Upgrading, where people are actually using urban design to both prevent violence from happening and figure out ways to contain and limit it when it does happen. And I think that's a great example of the UN sponsoring something that's out there that has a mitigative effect, even though it's not military.
Like a worldwide allied Marshall Plan almost.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily go that far given current fiscal circumstances, but one of the things about this is it doesn't necessarily get helped by a large amount of international assistance. In fact, in the last 5 years, private philanthropic donations have dramatically overtaken official government assistance as the main aid pattern within the world. And I had a very interesting conversation with the Gates Foundation last year about this question, because a lot of philanthropic organizations have a single issue focus, like health, right? So if your focus is maternal health and infant mortality, that's what you have money for, that's what you focus on. But looking at a city as a system, if that's your focus now, you better have a great education plan for 5 years from now, and you better have an awesome employment plan for 20 years from now. Otherwise, you're just creating a massive problem that's going to bite you in the ass, a generation from now, which we actually see in a lot of these cities out in the environment.
I think we'll end with this question, which I think is a little bit of a teaser, knowing what you're thinking about as well in the future. The process of forgiveness and reconciliation and leadership in post-conflict zones, right? Using Iraq, Afghanistan, Rwanda, right? Places that have been really struck by violence, struck by violence. Where do leaders get their mandates? How do they manage those mandates to do whatever the right thing is by them or by their people?
Right. Great point. And I think, to my mind, one of the under-acknowledged but really important elements of Afghanistan is that we never effectively made peace after 2001, right? I mean, basically every kid that ever went to high school in the last 80 years was taught that the least effective peace treaty in history was the Versailles Treaty after World War I. It's nothing compared to how screwed up the Bonn Agreement was. At least we invited the Germans eventually to come to Versailles to hear the dictate of the peace terms. We never even let the Taliban turn up. The Taliban actually surrendered and tried to make peace after 2001, acknowledged the authority of the new Afghan government and wanted to be part of a peacebuilding process, and we basically said no. We basically excluded them. And they came back in 2003, in part because they'd been excluded from this sort of reconciliation process that never really happened in Afghanistan. So I think actually that's the missing piece that we really need to focus on. In the last chapter of the book, I talk about some initiatives that have been very successful. One of those is the way that Liberian women in particular banded together and created a dynamic that led to the end of the Civil War in 2003. And it's worth just talking about women for a second. There's this kind of, I would say, gender equity way of thinking about women's involvement in these kinds of conflicts, which I think is important and it's relevant. But there's another way that I like to think about it, which is economics. So most of these big slum environments that we're talking about, there are no jobs for men in these environments. And that's not accidental. That's because they're designed as dormitory environments for labour forces that are supposed to work somewhere else. So we do a lot of work in townships in South Africa, as I know you guys do. Townships are there because the English colonial government and after that, the Republic of South Africa government put them there for unmarried men to be labour forces for the downtown area. If you live in San Jose, for example, the guy that delivers your mail doesn't necessarily have the money to live there. He probably lives 2 or 3 hours drive away, and he comes in to do that job, then he goes back to where he lived. Now, in urban environments in Africa, that's probably a slum, right? So most of the men leave the slum every morning to go work. The only people that really stay around that are male in the environment are young men, old men, or people that are on crime. Most of the actual jobs that exist in these environments are held by women, and almost all the businesses that do business in these environments are owned by women. So if you want to exclude women from your discussion of peace building, you're missing not only 50% of the population, which I think everybody understands that that's not smart, but you're probably missing about 80 or 90% of the actual economy that goes on the ground. And what happened in Liberia is a bunch of Muslim women and a bunch of Presbyterian women separately got together and then created an alliance among themselves to put economic pressure on the government to shut down the conflict. And then they went overseas with some help from a Nigerian a group of Nigerian lawyers to put pressure on the rebel side of the conflict and essentially force people to stop fighting. And that's one of the few examples of successful kind of bottom-up peace building that we've seen. But again, it's enabled by connectivity, and I think we're going to see more examples of this going forward. So I think peace building bottom-up is really important, but they still needed an international peacekeeping force led by the United States to come in and actually police the peace agreement once it was in place, right? So that doesn't let us off the hook. We still need to be ready to get into these environments, but I think ultimately the solution comes from within the society, or it doesn't come at all, right? You can't impose peace on people from outside, and you certainly can't impose legitimacy on a political system from outside. You can't assemble a state from discarded bits of other states and then bring in kind of the spark of legitimacy from outside. That's like building Frankenstein's monster out of body parts on a slab, right? And you can animate that with a lightning bulb. It's going to walk and talk for a little while, then it's going to go bad. And I think there's a few Frankenstates, out there that we've built that way. And I think the spark of legitimacy has to come from within the body politic itself. And where you see that succeeding, it's places like Liberia, a couple of places in Nigeria that have managed to be resilient in the face of conflict there. Libya, it's internally legitimate, and it often comes from this urban population that often gets disregarded. That's actually going to be the dominant population of the next generation.
Well, David, thank you very, very much.
Thanks, man.
This concludes our portion, but thank you.
Thank you for having me.